Japan is shrinking. Nope, not like that. Okay, well, yeah, also like that. But that's not the kind of shrinking this video is about. With a projected population decline of 30% and the elderly comprising 40% of the population by 2070, along with the abandonment of much of the country, Japan faces a serious crisis. Their population is shrinking. Since World War II, Japan has been dependent on the US for military and economic support. After becoming independent in 1952 and integrating into the Western economic system, massive investment coupled with low wages drove an economic boom, making Japan a global powerhouse by the 1980s. But speculative bubbles, stringent banking regulations, and subsequent economic stagnation have largely erased those gains. An aging population, declining birth rates, exorbitant urban living costs. These all pose a grave threat to the country's very existence. But why is Japan facing such a severe crisis? Before we answer that question, we'd like to take a moment to thank our channel sponsor, Aura. As you all know, we make political content here and on our other channels. Unfortunately, that means some people don't like us very much. These days, a quick Google search is all it takes to find someone's personal information. Data brokers sell your information to scammers, spammers, and anyone else who may want to target you. Your full name, email, home address, health records, your relatives, it's all readily available for those who want to find it. That's why I've been using Aura to help keep my private details private. Aura shows me which data brokers are selling my information and automatically submits opt-out requests for me. This not only cuts down on the amount of spam I get, but also helps me keep all my accounts safe from bad actors. I'll give you a real-world example. AT&T recently revealed that over 73 million customer records, both existing and former customers, were released on the dark web. They recommend that those affected change their passwords, monitor account activity, and consider fraud alerts or credit freezes from credit bureaus. This was a huge breach, but I don't have to worry. Aura does all of this for me. And best of all, I don't have to download a bunch of different apps just because some company couldn't keep my data secure. I value my privacy, and I'm sure you value yours. You can go to aura.com/firstthought to start your 2-week free trial, no strings attached. Try it out, and I promise you'll appreciate the peace of mind. Support the show and protect your valuable data by signing up today at the link below. After World War II, Japan was made completely dependent on US military protection and economic support, hosting US bases in return for market access and diplomatic backing. This relationship has persisted to the present day. Japan's dependence on the US has had a profound impact on political culture, entrenching a socio-cultural hierarchy that prioritizes American interest over national sovereignty. In fact, Japan is so vassalized that their actual support is far in excess of their obligations under the Status of Forces Agreement, which sustains the US military presence on the island. Secret agreements and extraterritorial privileges granted to US forces, such as immunity from prosecution in Japanese courts, have exacerbated local grievances, and rightfully so. US soldiers aren't exactly known for being respectful guests in occupied countries. Japan's post-war recovery was further shaped by economic policies aimed at integrating Japan into the Western economic system under the direction of the US. A significant reason the US aimed to bolster Japan's economy was to, unsurprisingly, counter communism. And this long-standing subordinate relationship has hardly changed at all over the past 60 years. After World War II, US aid, industrial technology, and economic planning initiatives drove high levels of investment and productivity, accompanied by low real wages and cheap labor from agricultural villages. In the 1960s, tightening labor markets led to real wage increases that outpaced productivity growth, reducing profit rates, an anomaly rarely seen in capitalist economies. Then in the 1980s, speculative bubbles in real estate and shares, spurred by fiscal and monetary policies to expand domestic demand, ultimately popped, tanking the economy. International disparities in interest rates caused more speculative trading of currencies and securities, which only worsened the problem. The resulting stagnation stemmed from the exhaustion of factors that previously fueled rapid growth. The Basel I regulations of 1987, which required banks to maintain adequate amounts of capital, made it difficult for Japanese banks to extend credit, prolonging the stagnation. Then came the Plaza Accord. US businesses couldn't compete with their Japanese equivalents, and a trade war was brewing. In the early 80s, the US forced through voluntary export restraints, pressuring Japan into agreeing to restraints on the export of certain goods, such as automobiles and steel, to protect American industries from competition. The US also threatened Japan with retaliatory tariffs for, quote, unfair business practices, as well as other limits on Japanese manufacturing. In 1985, the United States pushed through an agreement titled the Plaza Accord, whereby the US, Japan, West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom attempted to depreciate the US dollar against the Japanese yen and the German Deutsche Mark. This was done to reduce American trade deficits and increase the competitiveness of American exports abroad. Almost overnight, the yen's rapid appreciation made Japanese exports significantly more expensive and less competitive in international markets, leading to a decline in exports. Manufacturing, a staple of the Japanese economy which was heavily reliant on exports, faced reduced profit margins and sales as a result, prompting many companies to cut costs or move production overseas. The Bank of Japan lowered interest rates, a real estate bubble was quickly inflated, speculation on stocks and heavy borrowing to, quote, invest in the new opportunities of Japanese properties exploded, until eventually the bubble popped. Everyone saw this coming, but the Japanese economy became too close of a competitor for American capital to remain as it was, and as a vassal of the US, they accepted terms that clearly harmed Japanese interests. Fast forward to 2008, and the Japanese economy is contracting at an annual rate of 12.7%, its steepest fall since 1974. Japan's exports plummeted by 35% in December 2008, and when global stock markets dropped by nearly 50%, trillions of dollars in paper assets were wiped out. Looking at the increasingly dire statistics on this topic, Japan appears to be in serious trouble. In the early 1990s, Japan's total fertility rate, or TFR, had already begun a steep decline, falling from 2.14 in 1973 to just 1.5 by 1990. This trend continued into the 2000s, with the TFR dropping further to 1.26 in 2005. Projections for the 2020s estimate that the TFR will stabilize around 1.44, but this will still mean a significant population decrease, from 127 million in 2015 to 88 million by 2065. Meanwhile, the proportion of elderly people, those 65 plus, is expected to rise dramatically, from 26.6% in 2015 to 38.4% by 2065. Fewer young people and more elderly people is not a trend known for longevity, to say the least. But fertility rate is only one way to look at depopulation, so let's also consider population density. In 2000, there were 1,171 cities, towns, and villages designated as depopulated regions, making up 36.3% of the nation's municipalities. These areas housed roughly 7 million people, or 5.6% of Japan's total population, spread across 180,000 square kilometers, which is 48.5% of the country's total area. The population density in these regions was just 39.5 people per square kilometer, significantly lower than the national average of 340. Jumping ahead 21 years, things have only gotten worse. By 2021, depopulated areas comprised 51.5% of municipalities and 63.2% of the land area, but contained only 9.3% of the population. Depopulation has been particularly severe in rural areas. Collapse of core industries such as agroforestry due to an aging population and flight to the cities has led to a decline in regional society functions. Locals suffer from a lack of successors and marriage partners, which further exacerbates the decline. The economic activities in these areas have, unsurprisingly, stagnated, leading even more young people to seek better opportunities in the cities, a hallmark of industrialized nations around the world. Japan's economic development has historically led to uneven population distribution and regional function imbalance. As rural depopulation continues, the impact on agricultural production and social functions deepens, creating a negative spiral of economic downturn, farmland abandonment, and general social decline. The economic stagnation in these areas further reduces their appeal to younger generations, perpetuating the cycle of depopulation and economic decline. Here we can see the regional distribution of the population in depopulated areas, showing significant losses in Hokkaido, Tohoku, and Kyushu, accounting for about 60% of the total. These municipal mergers have centralized services, which usually also involves the loss of public facilities and jobs, as happened in Sado Island in 2004. So, why is this happening? If you're in the global north, or anywhere else for that matter, you've probably felt the pinch in your wallet recently due to severely worsening inflation and cost of living. But Japan has it much worse. Urban living costs in Japan are astronomical, especially in Tokyo. Young professionals are confined to micro apartments no larger than 8.83 square meters, or 95 square feet for Americans, which are not remotely suitable for raising a family. In 2020, the average cost of a one-bedroom apartment in Tokyo was about $1,100 per month, while two bedrooms averaged over $1,600 per month. Now, before you protest and, correctly, point out that these rents are lower than those in many major US cities, consider Japan's stagnant wages, which have barely increased over the past 3 decades, making these rental prices disproportionately high. Young people in Japan earning about $17,000 to $20,000 a year simply cannot afford these prices. Additionally, prospective renters face absurd requirements and upfront costs, including showing a bank account with 3 to 7 times the monthly rent, so having $3,300 to $7,700 in the bank, as well as paying 1 to 2 months rent in advance, another $1,100 to $2,200. In addition to those 2 months, you also need a 1-month non-refundable security deposit known as key money, another $1,100. As well as a non-refundable move-in fee paid to the landlord, which can be up to 3 months' rent, another $3,300. So in 2020, your initial move-in cost could be more than $14,300 plus key money, almost an entire year's salary. Let's move on to the next driver of the crisis, the extraordinarily demanding work culture in Japan. Overwork has reached such a point that there is a word for dying from it, karoshi. Overwork comes with severe health risks. In 1990, Japanese workers averaged 2,124 hours of work per year, significantly more than their counterparts in France and Germany, who each worked about 500 hours less annually. In 2016, a government survey found that nearly a quarter of companies mandated more than 80 overtime hours per month, often unpaid. The karoshi line, where overwork becomes significantly unhealthy, is set at 80 hours per month, 20 fewer than the legal limit in Japan. Despite efforts like the work style reform legislation of 2018 to reduce excessive working hours, long workdays remain the norm. Compounding this issue, depopulation has caused a severe labor shortage. Businesses lack the staff to operate at full capacity, forcing employees to work much longer hours just to maintain productivity. During the economic stagnation of the 90s, companies replaced full-time workers with cheaper temporary employees to save money, forcing those who remained to work longer hours out of fear of getting laid off. By 2021, Japan still had a high percentage of workers clocking more than 49 hours per week, second only to South Korea. Another major contributing factor to the depopulation crisis are the gender disparities in nearly all economic categories, all of which have deep roots in cultural and economic practices. The Equal Employment Opportunity Law of 1985 aimed to reduce gender discrimination. But in the 2023 World Economic Forum's Gender Disparity Index, Japan still ranked 125th out of 146 countries. Another shining success of liberal reform. Policies like former Prime Minister Abe's Womenomics have not significantly closed the gender gap either. Women remain underrepresented in managerial positions and overrepresented in part-time roles. This disparity is due in part to cultural norms, which place 2 separate burdens on women. The first requires them to fulfill intense work demands, and the second requires them to take on all the household responsibilities. And just like in the United States, the high costs of childcare and education add to the financial strain young families have to endure. In 2021, gross annual childcare costs for 2 children consumed nearly half the earnings of an average couple with full-time work. This intense financial pressure discourages young people from marrying and having children. Japan's gender wage gap is also the widest in the G7. Women only earn 75% as much as men for full-time work. These cultural norms cause many women to view economic independence and raising a family as mutually exclusive, and unsurprisingly, they're often forced to opt for independence. Despite policies intended to support working mothers, such as generous parental leave, the reality is that women still bear the brunt of domestic responsibilities, which gives them even less time and energy for just about anything else in life, including socializing and hobbies. This double bind makes it difficult for women to remain in the workforce after having children, despite strong societal pressures to do so. Companies expect women to work at full capacity, and at the same time, these women are criticized for prioritizing work over family. It should be obvious that high living costs, a demanding work culture, and significant gender disparities are all products of a system that prioritizes economic output over social well-being. Capitalism remains the root cause of all these crises Japan has faced for decades. Stagnant wages driven by the desire for ever-increasing profit places a heavy financial burden on young people who can't afford housing suitable for raising families. Then, even if you do have a family, work culture demands excessive hours, making it difficult to be present for them. Not to mention the health risk from overwork. Dying, unsurprisingly, reduces your time available for family life. And finally, the labor shortage that forces workers to endure even longer hours perpetuates the cycle of overwork. And the financial pressures of high childcare and education costs, combined with the gender wage gap, strongly discourage people from having children. It's the perfect recipe for population decline. The Japanese government's response to the depopulation crisis has been a series of policy errors, all of which failed because they didn't address the underlying issues. Broadly, they focused on declining population rates and aging demographics, which misses the broader socioeconomic factors contributing to the crisis. Efforts to balance work and childcare through extended maternity leave and childcare reforms do help, but they don't do enough to overcome the systemic factors at work here. These conditions discourage marriage and family formation. Financial investments and policy incentives aimed at revitalizing depopulated areas miss the mark. Statistical data from the Yamasato district shows significant population declines over the last decade. The reason past reforms failed and future reforms will fail is because they do not address the root cause of the problem. The problem is the pursuit of profit at all costs, including human lives. Japan faces a bleak future. The population is expected to fall by 30%, and the elderly will make up 40% of the population by 2070. The population will drop from 126 million to 87 million. Another, slightly more optimistic projection says the population will fall below 100 million in 2056, 3 years later than previously predicted. Still not great. On top of this, the total fertility rate is projected to decline to 1.36 by 2070. Increasing life expectancy is forecasted to reach 85.89 years for men and 91.94 years for women. This growing elderly population will have a difficult time getting the help they need, whether from professionals or overworked young family members. Japan's future looks grim, saddled with a problem that has no liberal solution. However, Japan can change, just as any other declining capitalist power can. The pursuit of profit over human flourishing is a dead end, and only radical systemic change can solve this crisis. Episodes like this one are made possible thanks to our generous patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help support the show, and get some great perks while you're at it, consider becoming a patron. Perks include access to our Discord server, early access to videos, ad-free episodes, and more. You can help us keep the channel afloat by becoming a patron at patreon.com/firstthought. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.